Before I get started, I just wanted to quickly thank the Guild for having me here. I always enjoy an opportunity to get out and talk a little bit with new people about what kind of things I'm up to. And I especially appreciate everyone being willing to hang out a little bit late. I know many people here are already here all or most of the day, and I appreciate folks sticking around. A little bit about me, I guess most of that was already covered. I come from Montana. I actually just recently relocated here to Washington, D.C., so my life right now looks kind of like watching the movie City Slickers backwards. It's been an adjustment, but it's pretty cool. I'm really happy to be here at SI. It's a fantastic place, a hive of creativity and inquiry, and it's deep history. It's amazing. But I was brought here to work on the Deep Time exhibition, which we're going to open up in 2019, which sounds kind of a ways out, but given the scope of the project, to me that sounds right around the corner. We're going to be busy. But I don't have a lot of content from that exhibit. I did bring one specific piece here that is going to be kind of a case study for us to look at. But most of what we're going to see early on here is stuff that exists in other museums. But I'm going to talk about primarily what it is here that we're doing as far as when we go to put a fossil on exhibit, what kind of choices do we face, and then what kind of decisions do we make based on the condition of the specimens, and what do we do in order to get to a finished product, so to speak, a mounted exhibit specimen that you can walk into a museum gallery and see and learn from. This is an area that, in my opinion, we in museum land don't talk enough about. A lot of folks really wonder how exactly do we get all this stuff and what exactly is it that they're looking at. One of the most common questions is even, is it real or is it not? And things like that. So we're going to get into some of that a little bit, and we'll talk about process a little bit, some materials and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And let's see, we'll go here. This is the most boring graphic ever, but it's very illustrative because I think that it says a lot about what we in the museum realm are really tasked with. If you think about the core mandate that we are given, it kind of pulls in somewhat opposed directions, because on the one side we have the task of preserving and protecting the objects that are in our care. In the case of vertebrate fossils that I play with, these are scientific specimens, right? They are going to continue to factor into research on into the future. We have to make sure they make it that far, right? But then on the flip side of that, we've got the other mission, which is to educate the public, to bring our research out into the community, and to hopefully inspire people to learn more about science in general, if not paleo in specific. And a lot of times those two goals are a little bit opposed, because if you think about it, the best thing that we could probably do to meet the preserve and protect part of this would be put all our stuff in the collection room, have our security personnel look after it, and just keep it to ourselves. But if we do that, we're pretty much blowing it on the whole education and inspiration part of the equation, right? So we need to get this stuff out. We need to let people see it and have some kind of interaction with it. And the question becomes, well, how do we meet both of those goals? And sometimes that's really a challenge when you're dealing with objects that can be millions of years old and, generally speaking, are not replaceable. And so I'm going to talk about how we get to that balancing point. And this is probably one of the most illustrative images that I have in terms of making this point. Does anyone know what that is, perchance? Yes. Also, yes. Someone sees what? Yes, you do. You do see a good-sized piece of jaw. This guy actually is a girl. This is a she. This is a specimen near and dear to my heart because it comes from my home state of Montana. This is a Tyrannosaurus Rex that we like to call B-Rex because Bob found it. But B-Rex has really become a very important specimen for a variety of reasons, but one of the most extraordinary things about it is that the preservation on it is exquisite, and to such an extent that there's been active research going on here that's finding soft tissue preservation within the bones. You may have heard some of this in popular media where we're finding things, proteins and different things. It's kind of changing our understanding of what's even possible in a fossil. And it's really an amazing specimen. And as it turns out, it's also a really nice looking dinosaur. And as it is right here, these are the actual fossils. I took them out and I just laid them all out and shot an image. But the question I like to ask people is, if you went to the museum and you walked in the door and you said, I'm going to go see a T-Rex, and they said, yes, sure, come on in, here you go, and they gave you that, how do you feel about that? Like, I would be really excited. I would be all over that. But generally speaking, that doesn't really do it for people because this doesn't give you much of a sense of what that animal actually looks like. But in terms of its utility to science, this is the best way to have this specimen because all of those individual bones are available for study. We can get all of that morphological data. We can do sampling if necessary. Whatever needs to happen is far more accessible there than it would be if we stuck all this back together into one giant piece and said, there, skull, right? And so the way that we strike that balance is to make molds of these fossils and then reassemble all of those bones as resin casts. And by doing that, we're able to give you a way better look at what the animal looks like while still preserving the scientific integrity of the specimen. And I like this example because I think that it illustrates that rather than the cast being sort of a cheap knockoff or a replica that we've somehow fooled the public with, instead this is actually an opportunity that we have given to the public because we're going to let you see this dinosaur as it existed, but we're still going to maintain the scientific utility of the fossil itself. And without this kind of molding and casting going on, we couldn't really present that opportunity. And so I'm kind of on a little mission here myself to just change the perspective out there so that when people see an exhibit label and it says cast or it says replica, instead of feeling like they just got a cubic zirconia when they really wanted a diamond, I would rather have them see that as, oh, someone went to a lot of trouble here to present this specimen in its most ideal state so that I can learn and understand. I think that's really a great thing, but we often don't tell that story very well. In this example, this really shows a lot of what's possible. You can see all these casts being put together. I've got the skull kind of stood up on end and looking straight up at the ceiling. The casts are different colors just because those are different batches of resin, so there's not really any rhyme or reason to it. It's just kind of what I had in the shop. But you can see the center portion on the image on the left. There's kind of a big open void in there. That's the nasal, right on top of the nose of this animal. And then the premaxillas, which is the very tip of the snout where the front teeth go, those are missing in this animal. And so the image on the right here shows that portion now reconstructed in clay. And I then made a mold of those clay portions, and so we can cast those as well. And now this dinosaur pretty much exists in kit form. It's like a Lego dinosaur. You can just cast up all the parts and then some assembly required. But it really gives us a nice opportunity to be able to show a complete version of that skull. That's what she looks like. And the reason I keep saying she on this one is because this is one of the very scant few examples in paleo where we can actually say anything about the sex of an animal. This fossil specimen actually has, within some of the long bones, a type of tissue called medullary bone. This is something that birds generate, female birds generate, in order to supply calcium to their eggshells. This dinosaur has that, which is really cool. So not only Do we know it's a T-Rex? We know it's a she, which is really neat. But anyhow, getting to this point, it kind of takes some doing. It's a lot of process, and it's helpful if you can kind of put together a couple of different skill sets. There's definitely a lot of art involved here, because any of the missing portions that need to be restored, that all happens with some sculptural capabilities. But because it is essentially a three-dimensional science illustration, there are rules. There are anatomical parameters that you need to stay within. And so it's really helpful to have that kind of a background. I actually have a biology degree, even though I make a living as an artist. I'm a big proponent of that idea too. We tend to treat that, in academia, we tend to treat that as an either-or kind of a fence, and you have to pick a side. And as anybody in here probably knows, if you do science illustration, that is not the reality at all. If you're going to be any good at what you're doing, you got to be able to hop on either side of that fence. I'm really a proponent of making that fence go away. Let's see. This is another T-Rex that I've built, but this one's a little bit different because this is the genuine fossil material. And then there are some areas throughout here that you can see that are kind of just a monochromatic brownish color. All of those areas are sculpturally restored. The rest is fossil bone. And I put this image in here because this is sort of the other alternative, right? If you're not going to use casts of your fossils and you're going to display the real thing, this is what you get. And so any of your sculptural restoration that's being done is happening right on the fossil itself. There are several specimens here at Smithsonian where that was done a very long time ago, usually with plaster. And for a long time, that was kind of just the thing to do. Nowadays, it's a lot more rare. It does happen occasionally. It's kind of a curatorial decision as to whether or not they want to go that direction with a specimen. But mostly, what I wanted to illustrate here is just that when you are dealing with genuine fossils, there are some hard limits that you face, and there are some extra considerations that go in. The next image that I have shows, it's not the best photograph, but this is looking right up into the roof of the mouth of that dinosaur, and you can see some of the steel armature that I had to fabricate that actually holds that specimen. As soon as you have real fossils, that's the kind of thing that has to come into play, because now you've got weight, sometimes a lot of weight, and you've got still a fragile object. And so there's got to be some way to support that. That in and of itself is like a whole other project in terms of the engineering and design of that apparatus. When you're dealing with casts, a lot of times you don't really have to do so much of that, because most of the structure that's going to hold this together can go inside of the bones. I've had a lot of people ask, how do I know if I'm looking at a cast or a real fossil? And the short version is usually, do you see steel? If there's metal around the outside of those bones holding things up, that's probably a genuine fossil. If you're not seeing any of that, it's because it's routed inside the bones, which means they're resin casts or plaster or some other material. And so when you're using a real fossil, not only do you have to think about how you're going to hold it up, but you also have to do everything that you build with the full understanding that you're kind of committed to it, right? Like in this instance, I've used a clay that's actually an epoxy. It hardens into a rigid plastic when it's cured. It's pretty permanent. I'm not going to say entirely permanent, because I suppose if somebody really wants to get that off of there someday, they probably can, but it's going to be really labor intensive and probably pretty risky to the fossil. So in a lot of ways, when this is the directive, you're kind of taking some risks, and you also have to be willing to just sort of live with what you get. Any kinds of distortion or crushing or any deformities that exist within the fossil, which is very common for things that are crushed under layers of rock for millions of years, you kind of just have to live with that, because there's no way that you can undo those problems. You can't bend things around or otherwise correct for those things. You kind of just have to live with them as they are. With casts, that's not necessarily the case, because those casts can be altered. We're definitely going to be talking about some of that in a little while. Here's a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. This is the holotype of Tyrannosaurus Rex, which means this is the specimen for which that taxon is named. This is the first one discovered. This was at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and this is the reconstruction that was done after the fossils were prepared. And as it turns out, yeah, that was, there's the publication. So it was a while ago. They actually mounted the whole animal, and it stood just like that at the Carnegie Museum all the way up until about 2005, when they took everything down, and they kind of went through the same process there that we are now going through here at Smithsonian. But anyhow, the skull on this animal was not terribly complete. In fact, it was largely incomplete. There are only 8 of the original skull bones preserved within this specimen. It was enough to let their discoverers know that, hey, this is somebody new and different. Somebody better write a paper, right? But there's not much to it. So when they took apart that giant plaster head with these dinosaur bones embedded in the middle of it, they essentially had to re-prepare the fossil all over again. It's kind of like taking it out of the rock again, except you're taking it out of the plaster this time. But once they got there, they were able to make molds of the bones and make some casts, and there they are. So having those, they sent those my way and said, we want to build a T-Rex skull, but we'd like this to be as much T-Rex as we can get, but we've only got 8 of the bones. So we're going to need to do a little work here. Fortunately, since I happen to be hanging out in Montana at a museum where they have more than a few T-Rexes to spare, one of which actually is about to live here, the bottom one there, I was able to go into the collection room and just start making comparisons and taking measurements. And so here's an array of different T-Rex specimens. The one here with the Carnegie Museum number, that's our target, that's the holotype. And so I essentially had to go through bone by bone here, trying to select elements that would be approximately the right size, because our goal was to make a composite skull, where we would use casts of individual bones from different animals, all T-Rexes, and assemble that all together into one skull. The alternative would be to sculpt all of the missing portions and go that way. But because it's the holotype of the genus, and because it was going to be sort of the crown jewel of this new exhibit, they really wanted to get as much T-Rex as they could get in here. So that's what we did. This is just a few images of the assembly process, and you can see the casts are different colors. My resin was this yellow stuff here. Those portions, most of those are the T-Rex that's going to be here now, the 555 one. But size-wise, it's actually a really good match for this guy. Here's a shot now. I've got the skull stood up looking at the ceiling again. You can see I've got nasals on there now. I've got the back of the brain case here. If you look carefully here, you can see a spot where I've actually just cut that. There's some distortion there, and I've literally just sawed that cast, and then I've got some steel rods in there to pin it back together. There's a few other spots through here where I don't know if we can see any on here or not, but I'm sure I have some other images. Most of these casts, when I go sticking these things together, are either pinned together with metal rods, or in many instances, I will literally screw them together with a drill and some drywall screws. If there's distortion, crushing, things like that, if something's warped out of shape a little bit, I can heat that plastic up and I can bend it back into shape. I can be completely brutal to these things. People ask me what I do, I tell them I'm a plastic surgeon, because that's pretty much what's happening here. And it's great because I can get away with it. Like, I couldn't do any of this stuff to a fossil. I would lose my job so fast it's not even funny, right? But I'm not doing anything to alter a specimen. There's no harm to science here at all. And yet, we don't have to live with some of the problems that fossils come with. Here's a shot of the lower jaws. We kind of took that through the same process. Let's see here. There we go. This is my mad science moment. This is the piece before any painting or anything, but that's the upper portion of the skull when it was completed. And I've actually got this is a good illustration. This is a map that just sort of shows really what we've done. And each color is designating a different Tyrannosaurus Rex specimen. And so you can see this really is kind of a Frankenrex of sorts. The curator I was working with at Carnegie and we dubbed this animal the unholy fusion because it is really kind of a conglomerate of all different things. But in the end, it actually has really nice symmetry. It's got all of the bones accounted for within the skull. It's a very complete restoration, and it's actually really pretty. If you go to the Carnegie now, you can see that skull on top of this beautiful mount that Phil Fraley and his crew put together. In the gallery itself, this animal is actually squaring off with another T-Rex directly across from it. And they're arguing over who gets to eat the hadrosaur carcass laying in the middle. It's really dramatic. But that was a really nice example of what you can do if you're able to make some copies of your dinosaur bones. And so again, opportunity. You didn't get you didn't get hoodwinked, you didn't get fooled, you were given a better opportunity to understand that animal. I think that's a win. I'm going out of T-Rex land for a minute now, and I just wanted to mention a little bit about how what we're doing is changing because of technology. These are casts of a bunch of skull bones out of Alaska. This is a juvenile hadrosaur locality. These are little edmontosaurids that are found on the North Slope in this vast deposit. I honestly don't know the geographic extent of it, but it's huge, representing, I don't even know, hundreds of individual animals. But it's a deposit where you kind of have a big churned up bone soup going on out there. Interestingly, they are all juvenile animals, which has its own implications about maybe the social lives of these animals. But for my purposes, when somebody said make a skull, what that meant is try to find each of the bones from this collection with the understanding that they're probably not from the same animal. And even though they're all young dinosaurs, there's probably going to be some variability within their size, and there definitely was. And so selecting all of these enabled us to get everything accounted for, mostly. But then we had this problem of scale a little bit. And the way that you can solve that now is surprisingly easy and really elegant. The darker colored pieces here are the resin casts of our fossils, and then the white pieces there are mirror image 3D prints that were made in order to sort of complete the missing portions of this skull. And by being able to make those replications quickly and very accurately, it really gives us a nice opportunity to build some really top-notch reconstructions. The skull itself looks like this. On the image that was out earlier for the invitation to this talk, where I'm playing with that dinosaur, that's the rest of this animal. I actually made 3 copies of it. There are 3 skeletons on display at the museum in Fairbanks now, but that's the head. You can see that it's got really nice symmetry and shows a very complete restoration. And it was pretty handy to be able to say that scale issue wasn't so much of a problem anymore, because we didn't have to find every last bone of the same size. As long as we had one side or the other, we could do that mirror imaging to great effect. So that's something that's starting to creep in more and more. We're getting to a point where I'm probably not going to have to get my hands dirty too much anymore, because rather than sculpturally restoring missing portions with clay or some other compound, we're kind of at the point now where we could scan those bones and then digitally sculpt the missing portions and then print the entire thing. And that's really cool. People ask me if I worry about that. Do you think that's going to steal your job? No, I don't worry about that at all. It's just another hammer. It's a different tool, and a really cool one. So we're starting to see more and more of that creeping in as well, and it's changing the way we're doing things. But the rest of this evening, I wanted to talk a little bit about this particular animal that is a Smithsonian dinosaur. This is Ceratosaurus. Ceratosaurus nazicornis was excavated in 1883. This is one of Marsh's dinosaurs. It actually went on display here in 1910 with the then new building that we're all hanging out in here. And this is what it looked like at the time. And it pretty much stayed like that for a long time. This image shows, I think this was taken in like 2014, so very recently. Not much has changed. And when it was collected, it was partially prepared on the side here that is exposed, but then it was just embedded in this big plaster wall. Many of the bones actually still have the original rock matrix on the back side of this, on the other side of the animal. All of that's being prepared out now, and our plan is to actually remount this skeleton in a different posture, and it will be a freestanding 3D mount of the whole skeleton. So instead of just being sunk into a fake rock wall, you're going to be able to see all the way around this thing. And because of that, we thought that it might be nice to do something about the head. This guy has some issues a little bit because of the brutality of taphonomic processes. There's a lot of crushing with this specimen. This is a photograph of the actual fossil. This is the holotype of its genus, so it's an important specimen. And it's actually pretty complete. It's just a little bit difficult to work with. It's not the easiest to interpret. But most of it is there, and that's actually really helpful for what I'm currently doing to it. I'm in the process of reinflating this into a three-dimensional full skull instead of a pancaked, squashed version of the skull. And so to get there, I actually brought some of this stuff with, and in a few minutes, you guys are going to be welcome to come up here and check all this out. But here's how we're getting there. Using the mold that we have made of the specimen, I'm able to choose the parts that I need and cast those in a plastic resin. And what's happening here is I'm using the mold a little bit unconventionally. You can see these registration keys here. There are other sections of this mold that all fit together. And what happens is when you put all of that together and you fill it up with your casting material, you get a solid cast of that specimen. There's actually one here. This is a plaster cast. It's kind of heavy. But this is what you get, is a solid replica of that skull. And you can see that he's pretty flat. He's pretty squashed. But what I'm doing instead is I'm not closing up the mold. I'm leaving it open, and I'm casting it, instead of as a solid piece, I'm casting it as just kind of a thin skin of plastic. I'm coating the inside of the mold selectively in different sections in order to get the components that I need. And then I can peel those out of the mold and utilize them separately to reconstruct the skull. And because the internal portion of this is all smashed together and full of rock, our mold does not give us those details anyway, right? So since I'm only going to get the exterior, I'm going to have to rebuild everything in the middle anyway. This seems like a good way to get there, because instead of leaving me with this big solid chunk of something, I now have these thin pieces that are more malleable. I can heat them up and bend them, I can cut them up, I can do whatever I have to straighten this guy's head out. So here are a couple of casts. These are sort of the two main halves of the skull. And once you get to that point, you've got a really nice launch pad to get to a head. Here I've got those two sections together. I've taken the half that contains the roof of the skull, and I've heated it up and kind of bent it back down into roughly perpendicular with the side of the skull so that I can have the top mostly complete. You can see a space up here where I've actually made a cut in order to kind of, it's sort of a relief cut that enabled me to flatten out that skull roof, because it's got a lot of buckling and folding going on. And you can see on this one, here's my drywall screws right there. So I literally just screwed the pieces together. Yeah, there they are. And let's see. Yeah, here we go. This is a little further on in the process. In order to restore some missing portions, we've got a few places here where there's kind of gaps that need to be bridged. And so the trick I like to do, a lot of this is really low tech, but it works nicely. I use this aluminum wire, and I can install that right onto these casts. I can just drill holes wherever I want it to anchor into, stick that wire in there, and bend it to whatever shape I want. And I'm basically just building kind of a wireframe structure that will delineate the contours of the bone that's missing. So once I put that in place, then I cover it up with aluminum foil, which is wonderful stuff because it holds whatever shape you put it into. And really all I'm trying to do is just turn that wire frame into a solid panel, right? And the reason I do that is because then I can get out some more of my casting resin and I can paint that all over that aluminum foil, let it set up, and now I've got a rigid, hard platform that I can sculpt on top of with my clay. So I know it'll support itself and it's not going to collapse and cave in. So there are several areas throughout this animal that have to go through that same process where you get some substructure, put in some aluminum, put on some resin. This is a shot of looking into the roof of the mouth, which you can see the skull is largely empty, right? This is kind of just a hollow skin of this head. You can see I've got some of my aluminum wire up there. That's getting ready to build some of the palatal bones. And piece by piece, each of those gets built until eventually it's time to start getting some structure in here. Here I've got more of my aluminum foil, just using it to sort of flesh out the contours of these bones. This is more palatal stuff, so it's all like pterygoids and palatines and things in the roof of the mouth. But once those things are in, and everything's coated up in resin, then you're ready for the clay work. And the clay that I'm using is actually an epoxy. So it begins like a modeling clay, but once it's cured, it's a hard plastic. But it's a great medium because you can not only shape it the way you want, you can apply any texture that is needed. And in this instance, what I'm doing is I'm trying to replicate the texture of the fossil itself, just so that this whole thing looks consistent. So I'm essentially taking an educated guess at what's not there. Anatomically, we do have other fossils to refer to. We've got some stuff that puts me in the right place, at least as far as the anatomy goes. And then as far as all that texture goes, I need to just look at the specimen itself and then say, okay, if that's what it looks like on the outside, well, if we took all the rock out of the inside, what would that look like? And that's the area that I'm really focused on right now. So with that, I'm going to switch from on screen to on the table, and we're going to be able to look at some of these things a little bit. I brought a few of the tools that I'm using, and I brought some casts that we can talk about, and you guys are going to be welcome to check that out. But I brought the skull that you just saw. He's right here. And you can see that he's not really flat anymore. And he's starting to look like a honest-to-goodness head here. He's doing pretty good. Palatal elements are all in. The clay that I'm using, this batch actually comes in a nice dark brown. You can get it in different colors. I sometimes like to use a pretty good contrast, just so I can tell where I've been, where I haven't. But there's a bit left to be done in here yet, but not too much, and I'll be ready for teeth. We are going to have to restore all the dentition here, and that's going to be a bit of a job because we don't have very many original teeth from this specimen, so I'm probably going to be doing some sculpting here. But it's coming along nicely, and you can definitely get a sense of the proper proportions of the animal as far as the width of the skull, the overall profile and shape. I've got the quadrates back here where the lower jaws hook up. Those are spaced correctly so that when I go to get the lower jaws ready, those should hook up and they should align correctly now. So instead of having some kind of a misaligned, weird underbite kind of a problem, he should have functional jaws. So we're really getting to the point of a complete head here. So I have that up here that you guys are welcome to come and check out. I have some of the tools here and some of the things that I've been using in order to achieve some of the textural qualities that are going on in here. This is a portion of that mold. You're welcome to check that out. as well. And I've got 2 other casts up here. And one of these is, this is actually the one that was on exhibit. I'm not sure when this happened. Originally, when it was mounted, the fossil skull was part of the exhibit. And eventually, I think somebody decided that they really ought to take that back into the collection room where researchers could access it, and so they replaced it with a cast. I don't know when that was done, but my guess would be maybe when the last time the whole dinosaur halls were redone in 1980. So a lot of people have been looking at this guy for years. But it's a good one to bring because it definitely shows the kind of pancaked, squashed character of the original fossil. After that was taken out, subsequent preparation was done that actually disconnected the lower jaw and exposed more details on the skull. And so I have another cast made after that preparation was done. And so you can kind of get a progression here where we've gone from the original pancake to the better exposed and more complete look at, but still pancake, all the way to what is about to become complete head. And all of those are up here, and I would welcome you guys to come and check all that stuff out. And if there are questions about any of it, I'm happy to address that as well.
Question?
Sure.
The surface of your recreation there is still very rough in feel. Is that what the skull is really like, or is that a result of crushing?
In real life, it's probably a good deal smoother, but I'm essentially trying to replicate the same textures that are on the outside that we can see. And so assuming that that's what's gone on here, it's hard for me to believe that the inside would be completely smooth like brand new bone. And so I'm really just trying to be consistent with that. And so a lot of what goes on here is I spend a lot of time laying in all of this nice anatomy, and then I come in and damage the heck out of it. But that's kind of satisfying in its own way. Yeah?
A couple questions. What's the cure time of that clay?
Your working time with it is probably best within like an hour.
Really?
Still somewhat malleable within a second hour, although you can definitely feel it getting a lot more resistant. Total like hardness is more like probably 5 to 6 hours. A lot of times with my workflow, I'll usually lay in a bunch of it, work the texture over, and then just assume that I'm probably not going to be playing with that part of that skull again until the next day. I let it just sit overnight and come back to it. But if I jump around a little bit from one region to the next, I can kind of keep moving forward throughout the day.
I've got a couple of other questions. When you were doing the old specimens before you had this stuff, how did they calculate the body weight strength ratio of the bones so they knew how much support?
Do you need to repeat that? That would be helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
The question was essentially, I think, when you're designing the armatures, the steel work that's going to hold these fossils, how do you calculate where those should go, right? Structurally, where do they need to be? What are the physical limits of the bones? Those kinds of things. Short answer, you guess. I don't really know a magic formula there. A lot of it, after you've dealt with enough of it, starts to become kind of intuitive. I suppose now, if you really wanted to get fancy, you probably could CT scan them and then go through like a finite element analysis engineering program or something, and you could figure out exactly what shear forces and what compression forces they'll tolerate and all of these kinds of things. Most of the time, we're not quite that fancy. We usually, if anything, try to over-engineer so that we don't end up having something collapse midstream.
One last question.
Sure.
What percentage of the dinosaurs that they have found that they've been able to reconstruct? I mean, I imagine it's a small percentage. There's a lot of them just housing in the museum that they never.
Oh,
put together.
like out of all the dinosaurs anybody digs up, how many
What
get
percentage?
built for display?
Yeah.
Good question. I don't even know how to take a shot at that. I think a lot of times the sort of best and brightest will find their way into exhibit content, whereas some of the others might still have a lot of value scientifically, but aren't always much to look at. Or in some cases, maybe they're also nice specimens, but we just have a lot of them, you know. At the museum back in Montana, we have a lot of duckbill dinosaur material, and some of that stuff is exhibited, but once you've got some of that out there, if there's, you know, who knows how many more back in the collection room, you're not really getting much more out of it by building more of them. So a lot of times it's just a matter of kind of overload. But as far as what percentage of dinosaurs that you see on exhibit, like what percentage of all dinosaurs found does that represent? I really don't know. I'm not sure. Yes?
So first of all, that was an amazing enlightening talk. Thank you very much.
Sure.
You mentioned, I just was curious more about your history. You said you're a biologist, and I'm curious what kind of got you on.
What the heck happened here? Yeah, right. Well, okay, well, let's see. I'm in high school. I'm thinking about possible trajectories. I'm looking at my transcripts. I got a counselor sitting across from me that says, well, it looks like you do pretty well in sciences. Probably going to have to stay in state if you're going to afford to go to school. Yeah, might want to think about Montana State. I was like, okay, I'll look at that. And then I found out, like, oh, actually, there's this museum there that has dinosaurs. And oh, yeah, I'm going there, right? So I did. When I got there, part of the package for financial aid, in addition to a wondrous student loan millstone, was a work study allotment. And as luck would have it, I went to look for a job, and this was back in the day when you had to actually read on a bulletin board, right? And I saw this little announcement saying that the paleontology lab was looking to hire a work study student. And I thought, all right, am I on candid camera? What's going on here? This, you know. Turns out it was for real. So I went there, and I got the job and started learning how to prepare fossils, how to make molds, a lot of that kind of stuff. All the while, I sat on the fence in school trying to decide, am I an art major? Am I a science major? You know, what am I going to do here? You know, well, sooner or later, your advisor says, you know, you need to choose something. So finally, I said, okay, biology, we'll do it. But throughout all of that time, I spent a lot of time in the fine art department. I took a lot of metalsmithing, sculpture kind of stuff. Did a lot of work in jewelry, actually, which is really kind of a fun thing, just when you want to work at a little smaller scale. But all of that kind of just smashed together to put me here. It all starts from a lifelong interest in dinosaurs. I can actually remember as a small child crawling underneath the table and arranging all of my little plastic dinosaurs. And if somebody asked me what I was doing, I said, I'm building a museum. So it's what you get. Yes?
How sure can you be between the pancake and the expanded model that your expansion is true to type, so to speak?
The question was just essentially, how confident can we be in the accuracy of the reconstruction as far as, is this a good representation of what this looks like if we did expand that skull out? I would say pretty sure. And the reason I say that is because even though he's mashed here, and when you guys come up here, I can definitely point some of these features out, but some of the bones that are present on the interior of this, if you know how those should be oriented, if not for crushing and squashing around, if you pull those back out into position, that sort of dictates like how wide it is across the roof of the mouth, right? And so then you've sort of set a limit that, you know, if those are going to attach at the anatomical landmarks that they should hook up with, then the head's not going to get any wider than this, you know. And then there can be some other clues as well, as far as like on the back of the skull, you have sort of a fixed width here usually that is reasonable, and beyond, you go much further than that, and then you're going to start to have trouble in the center of the skull. The brain case isn't going to align properly. And so a lot of it will kind of tell you what it wants to do. And it does help that we can do a lot of reference. There are other animals ascribed to the genus Ceratosaurus in other collections, and I've been able to obtain some information by checking those out. You can also kind of shop around the family tree a little bit. Not real close, but somewhat close relative here is Allosaurus. And that's actually a very well-known dinosaur. I've actually built one of those heads too. And so sometimes you can look around at cousins, so to speak, if you're really in doubt as to generally what the anatomical features ought to be doing. But for the most part, within most lineages of dinosaurs, we have a pretty good sense of the basics anyway. If somebody goes out and finds something totally weird that we've never ever seen before, that's going to be a challenge. Yes?
Are there any T-Rex skulls somewhere in museum collections that haven't been squished?
Yeah, actually. The American Museum of Natural History, their T-Rex specimen, which we do have a cast of here, at least we've got one in the basement anyway. I don't know if it's been on exhibit, but that one is largely uncrushed.
So you go look at that.
So if you go look at that one, you're seeing one that really didn't need a lot of help at all. There's the one called Sue that's at the Field Museum in Chicago. That one got kind of squashed vertically, and so they did correct for that and used a cast on the skeletal mount, but then they do also display the real skull in a big glass case adjacent to it. And that one, you can definitely see some squishing that's going on, but with the exception of the squashed in nose, the rest of it actually is pretty good that way. There are a few of them around that are in pretty good shape that way. There's another one that is looking very encouraging that was recently discovered. Not prepared yet, so I don't know for sure what we're going to get, but early indicators are that it's a sweet head, so that one's probably going to be pretty cool too. Yes?
What's the difference in scientific quality between using resin and making a 3D printer?
Oh, the difference in quality between a cast and a 3D print?
If you're going to analyze it from a scientific point of view.
Okay. At this stage, I would put my money on the 3D print. If your molds are made well, and if you're careful with your casting processes, you can get remarkably accurate replicas. But there is some probability for some error there. I think that's less probable with the 3D print. If you have your printer calibrated properly, if your scans are done well, like that, it is what it is, and it's just going to replicate it. That's not going to be of any utility for like histological sampling or some of the other things that go on research-wise. But if you're looking at just sort of gross scale morphology and you just need the shape of that object, because you're going to do morphometrics or something, I'd feel comfortable operating with a 3D print. The printers they're getting remarkably good these days. Yes?
How useful are modern day birds for certain parts of the dinosaur tree for helping?
They can be very informative, for sure. There are a lot of anatomical similarities. So yeah, I like to look at birds, for sure.
Now, is that going to be what goes on display, or is that going to be used as a cast?
This could be.
What about the rest of the dinosaurs? Do you work on that, the skeletons?
I will probably be involved with some of that as well. There's a team of us that are working on that because there are so many bones. And so there's a good probability that, yeah, I'll probably be building some vertebrae and some other issues that have to be resolved. But, yeah, I guess. I like to say I run a head shop in the basement. But, yeah, the whole animal needs some process. I mean, we're making molds of all of the bones to make a full skeleton and stuff. So I would imagine that I will probably not stop when the head is done. I'll probably keep going. Yes?
What are the size limits of 3D printing these days, and what determines whether you're digitally sculpting or 3D?
Cost is pretty much the determining factor. 3D printers up to a certain size are fairly accessible. There are some very large format 3D printers out there. To get the level of accuracy that we would want for exhibit quality features, you'd probably be looking at machines that are, $1 million printers. So I don't know any museums yet that have those in-house, but I have known of a few instances where they've contracted out with companies to do some large format prints. There's an artist, Gary Staub. I don't know if anybody's heard of him. He does a lot of paleo stuff, as well as a lot of wildlife and stuff. Nice guy. He did a project recently where what's his name? Is it Otzi, the Iceman? That specimen was CT scanned, and then they fed that data to a 3D printer, and they actually printed a copy out in actual size. So that's like a human-sized print, and it was printed, I believe, actually I'm certain that was done in a single piece, and it's an SLA print, which is very high resolution. I don't even want to know what it cost, but really a cool trick. So the size limits are largely more financial limits than anything else at this point. There's all kinds of crazy experimenting going on in 3D printing. They have really big ones, and they spit out concrete, and so they can print a house, or So it's really changing rapidly. But we can get a lot done with a more modest-sized machine. A lot of times it just depends on whether or not you're willing to section a model up into multiple pieces that can then be put back together. But sometimes it's worth that because that still might be the faster way to get to where you need to be. Yeah.
How many person hours do you say it takes a team to reproduce as far as T-Rex or?
Good question. Well, let's see. I've known of a couple of projects done out of house where they've been able to mount an entire skeleton like a T-Rex over the span of 3 or 4 months, but that would be with a team of probably 15 people or so, some of who just do steel and that's it. Others that do sculptural restoration and that's it. And then it kind of gets divvied out among different skill sets. And that is in an instance where the museum says, here are finished prepared fossils. So starting from there, it can be a few months, but it kind of depends. The T-Rex head that I showed you that was the genuine fossil, I did the reconstruction of all of that, which meant put all the pieces together, many of which were crumbs like the size of my fist that no one had identified yet. It was collected in the 1960s, but that one, I did all of that. I built the missing parts. I built the steel work that holds it up. Everything start to finish was about 8 months, but I was the only one working on it. So there's strength in numbers. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what's involved in redoing the new dinosaur exhibit?
Oh gosh. That's a whole other talk, and honestly, I'm probably not the one to ask.
Hopefully it's someone we can get to talk to us in the future.
I would imagine that would be a thing. I know some of what's going on in there. I have seen a complete listing of specimens, but there's so much about this that I still don't even know. I've got kind of a hit list of the things that I'm responsible for that I'm clipping through, and each of us has that. And we all have some sense of what's going on, but the short version is it's a lot, but it's really cool. I think it's going to be well worth the wait. I think it's really going to take things forward. The hall that it goes into is, I think it's like a 30,000 square foot room or something, so you can fit a lot of dinosaurs in there. And everything else. And it is everything else. Yes?
What part of this do you enjoy the most?
Oh, wow. Jeez. I get to play with dinosaurs all day. I mean, that's right? I think as far as within the process, Each part is interesting, but for me, a lot of times, one of the most satisfying parts of it is the painting. Just because that's the last phase when it all of a sudden kind of becomes real. That's when it really looks like what it is. And I think part of that maybe is just a sort of sense of like crossing the finish line finally, and that's good. But it's also just, it's kind of meditative, sort of enjoyable, and you're past any of the engineering difficulties or any of the challenges that you run into. Like by that point, you've pretty much solved all the problems, and so then you're solely just focused on making it look good, you know? So that's probably my favorite, I think. Ask me again in a couple of months. Yes?
How much interaction, like a movie like Jurassic Park, would like the scientists be having with the people that are making the movie?
How much do they have, or how much do the producers listen?
However you want to answer the question.
Well, the guy that I used to work for in Montana was the advisor for those films, and the way I understand it from him is that you can tell them a lot of stuff, but whether or not they choose to utilize that or not is sort of dictated by what they think is going to make a good story. And so I guess it depends on the nature of the product. If it's a documentary film, that's probably a little more accurate, although not always. If it's Hollywood, if anything goes. And it does. Yes?
When you go from the skeleton to, say, the Jurassic Park kind of sort of animatronic version, or just the static version with the flesh and what feathers or whatever, do you do this, or do you work with these people, or what?
Just getting into that, actually. I have not historically done any of that work, just because it's kind of not been what I've been asked to do. But I do find the idea interesting. I have a work at home right now in progress, but I have a real difficult time finding the time to work on it very much. But it's something I've been wanting to entertain for a while, just to kind of jump to that next level in terms of. Yeah, there can be. There can be. Sometimes museums will choose to do dioramas or features where they are wanting to show a life restoration of the animal. Some of my favorite projects that I've seen are what's called a Lowell mount, where one side of it's like split sagittally right down the middle of the animal, and on one side it will be all anatomical, sometimes muscular or skeletal or whatever, and then on the other side it's got skin or feathers or everything. And so you can walk around from one side and see like, oh, here's the whole animal, and then you can walk around the other side and it's like you have x-ray vision and you can see the bones. I think that's really a neat way to approach that. Also saves a lot of space. You get two dinosaurs in the footprint of one, and if you're an exhibit guy, that's gold. Yeah.
With all the abilities that you described to replicate, is it going to become more and more rare to actually see the real fossils in the hall?
I don't think so. I think no matter what you do, there's always going to be such a interest in and kind of almost reverence for the genuine article that I think a lot of times a museum is still going to choose to do that when they can. But it depends. Some specimens really just aren't going to allow for that. It's too risky and it shouldn't happen. The responsible thing is to leave that in the collection room. Other specimens are well suited to it and have at it. If you choose to take that route, you're going to spend a lot of money. And a lot of times I think that's a determining factor sometimes as well. Do we do a cast? I mean, it costs a lot of money to make all the molds too. This compound, this RTV silicone is $100 a gallon, and you can go through a lot of it if you mold a whole dinosaur, plus all the labor involved and stuff. Like it, either way, it costs money, but it's very expensive to mount real fossils. We will have a number of those in the new exhibit, and we are spending real money. Yeah.
One last question on that as well. Are you prepared for the next earthquake?
Am I prepared for the next earthquake?
Confident with what you're putting out of the hall?
I hope to be. The giant T-Rex skull that I showed you there, the real fossil one, that's the largest T-Rex skull known to science. It's big. I built it, I put it up in the museum, and I went, got that handled. And then a few years later, I got this phone call, and they wanted to know, how do you think that'll hold up to seismic activity? We're doing a traveling exhibition and we want to send it to Japan. They sent it to Japan. It came back. It's fine. There was actually a quake while it was there. Still fine. I like to think it's because I build a real good dinosaur, but I have a feeling we probably got lucky there. But those are sometimes considerations. I know within the halls here, that's something that is definitely being thought of, and I think a lot of it is playing in less on the mounts themselves, but more on the substructure that's beneath them. Because I think that's where you're mostly going to be able to arrest or at least somewhat mitigate vibrations and things like that. But that can very well be a concern, which is another argument for casts, because if the whole thing comes crashing down, you can always get the molds out and pour another copy. Tough to do that with a fossil. Yeah.
Speaking of making copies, how often do you end up doing multiple copies and spreading them around in different places?
That's very frequent. There's kind of two streams for that. One of them is just to help facilitate research. A lot of times museums will exchange casts just so that they can collect data. But a lot of times in exhibits as well, that will happen. There are, well, like the TRex that's coming here, the 555 specimen, I don't even know how many casts of that are out there in different museums around the world, but there are several. And in cases like that, that sometimes becomes a fairly respectable revenue stream for the institution that has that specimen. And so a lot of times you'll see that happening as a means of funding further paleo stuff, or sometimes you'll see exchanges between institutions. I'm a big fan of it myself. I was a kid growing up in Montana, and you know, at that time, the only way you were really going to get too close to a real dinosaur was to get on a plane and go to New York or something, or Chicago, you know, and that was not readily available. And so I think anytime you can distribute them around more, I think that's a win. That's a good thing. But it definitely happens quite a bit, and there is a active commercial market out there as well, where museums will purchase casts of other specimens, sometimes even just private individuals. I know of someone that has a cast of, I think there's a T-Rex called Stan from South Dakota, very complete, nice specimen. There's a guy that's got a cast of that in his house. He really likes dinosaurs. And he has a lot of money. So they're out there, you know.
Okay, well, why don't we, if you have more questions for Michael?
Yeah, why don't you guys jump up? Come on up and take a look here.
There's some brochures.
Oh, thank you.
Some food labs over here.
One Montana to another?
Yes?
Yeah.
Where at?
I'm from Livingston.
Oh, you're just over the hill.
Yeah, just over the hill,
Excellent.
yeah.
Sure. Oh man, I've blazed past that town I don't know how many times, because I grew up in Billings.
Did you?
So my
Yeah,
mom
well,
lives there, and so I've done that stretch of I-90 a
Oh, yeah. Well, my
zillion
grandparents
times.
lived
But
there almost
that's a
too.
beautiful valley.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. So, no, I,
Where?
Livingston, Montana.
Well, I know he's living.
Bozeman.
You're Bozeman.
Yeah,
Okay.
just over the hill.
Over the hill,
We're-
yeah,
We're like
yeah.
half hour away from each other.
We used to have this Montana Mafia here.
Yeah.
Near the
Yeah.
yeah, just a
Don't
few.
start a new one.
Mike, I imagine the amount of people in the world that do your kind of job is pretty few.
Small. Yeah.
Do you find
It's a niche.
that when somebody does the same skull you do, that their interpretation of the actual sizes are pretty close in tolerance?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's a real science to it.
If they're staying within the lines, you're going to get what you're going to get. So yeah, usually.
Well, I started out as a medical illustrator. And
Oh,
as a
cool.
Scientific illustrator, got a job here, worked 30 years here.
Oh, geez.
And I've been retired now for 17 years.
I seem to keep running into people here that have stories like that, where it's like, well, I took this job for a year and a half,
This is the
and
first time I've been
25
back
years
to the museum
later.
for 17 years.
Oh wow, really?
And because
oh wow.
of your talk.
All because of me? Wow.
But I'm glad to meet you.
Oh, I'm glad you could make it in. This is a fun event. Here's that.
Pancakes.
The pancake, like these are all
Yeah.
those palatal bones, and so they're kind of just squashed in here, but they're still available. And so what I did was I've used as much of it as I could get at, right?
Yeah.
in order to get those in place. And so then when it was time to do the opposite side, I just kind of gave it the mirror image, and that would sort of dictate the proportions across the skull. So between that and the brain case, I feel like it gave you a pretty good approximation of what the width of this head ought to look like. If you're going to fit these things in there, it's got to be at least that wide.
What kind of paint do you use to paint it? Like acrylic?
I like
paint,
acrylics.
or- yeah.
Yeah.
Does it hold up pretty long?
It depends on what you're going to do with it. If it goes on exhibit and nobody can touch it, it'll hold up just fine. For education casts and things that are handled a lot, almost no paint is going to put up with that. Although you can get epoxy paints that are pretty durable, and I have sometimes gone with that. But for most of the stuff that goes on exhibit, all it's got to put up with is an occasional dusting.
Yeah.
So, and I like the way you can blend acrylics. You do a lot of washes and things, and yeah, so it's really.
Thinly and just like layer and layer?
Yeah, well, usually pretty heavy for the base. You know, there's like a dominant color. If it's Cretaceous Hell Creek stuff, it's kind of a chocolate brown, and then there are layers of paint that go over that. Some of which are pretty diluted and thin, but it kind of just varies from specimen to specimen. Depends on what the color palette looks like and. The pancake.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, he's pretty squashed.
Pretty flat there.
But he's remarkably complete.
I know.
I mean,
Mostly there, isn't
it's
it?
there. It's just flattened. Yeah. Yeah.
When like, do you edit the like this is a squish? Do you like edit the shape in any rendering software? Like what do you use?
No, but you surely could. Probably like. I bet ZBrush would be your best bet. You could probably do it with Blender or Mesh Lab or something, but I think it would be really tedious. I think ZBrush would probably be the better bet. That's the one I'm just trying to learn now, and it's so cool. It's supremely cool.